ما تخاف من الدش.
Exactement, ça marche. Tu es prêt?
Ouais. ديال traduction.
On est prêt, on peut lancer? Hein? Je peux, c'est bon. Les casques de traduction, ça marche? Ouais.
Ladies and gentlemen, the session will now begin. Please take your seats.
In recent years, the world has witnessed a multitude of protest movements, with a clear increase since the financial crisis. Is it a sign of a healthy democratic experience, or that of a deep and generalized discontent? These social movements have demonstrated the growing frustration of socio-economic policies and pointed at some dysfunctions in democracies. With street power seemingly coming back at the center of world geopolitics, governments are increasingly brought back to the fundamentals of the balance between power and people. How can we preserve values of democracy in today's mutating world? What's at stake in today's world governance? In an era of proven instances of manipulation and interference in news and social media, how can governments ensure freedom of expression while addressing these challenges?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, anchor and journalist at NBC News and MSNBC, Richard Louis.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Atlantic Dialogues, the 11th time we get to gather. It is great to be back with you. This is, I don't know how many times, my first year was 2016, and I'm looking forward to our conversations on day 2. Of course, the theme, cooperation in a mutating world, opportunities of the wider Atlantic. And our discussion to kick you off this morning, for those of you who were able to get some sleep, despite a very exciting first day, is street power, willpower, and democracy. And we hope to hear from all of you during the conversation. Please feel free to open up your apps we will have several questions, exactly 3. And tell us your questions and answers. Hopefully we'll have answers up here. But your questions in the app, I will be looking for the questions, and I will address them to our panelists. And we have a very exciting group of panelists to start us off on day 2 of Atlantic Dialogues 2022. I'd like to first welcome up here to the stage Laura Alvarez, Professor, Research Fellow of the School of Law at the University of Chile. In addition, we have Amre Moussa, former Secretary General, League of Arab States as well. I'd like to welcome up Mr. Secretary General. Madam Minister, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In addition to that, our third panelist this morning is Paulo Portas, former Minister of Foreign Affairs from Portugal. Warm welcome.
Morning. Okay.
All right. We should have walk-on music for all 3 of you.
Thank you.
Paulo, please. Thank you so much. So our discussion today is about street power, willpower, and democracy. Those are 3 very big words. And I guess I'd like to start with this question. And I'll start with you, Mr. Minister. When's the last time you took a walk in the street? And what did you learn? What did you learn about what the streets want today?
Bonjour à tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation, for being here once again in your beautiful country.
And I believe in democratic power through vote more than uprisings. Okay, so you have, if I remember well, you have a first contrast. We live in globalization, but we don't have global governance, which is one of our major problems. I don't talk about new international order, but I would mention how far we are from having an international management crisis system, at least as COVID and war in Europe showed impressively.
Yes.
So if you just pay attention to the top of our international organization, which is the United Nations, the Security Council, just pay attention to the 5 countries that have veto power in the United Nations. US, China, Russia, United Kingdom, and France. It's a photo from 1946, the winners of the Second World War. But we live in 2022. Why don't we have, as permanent members of the Security Council, India, which is the largest populated country in the world? Or Japan, the 3rd economy of the world? Or Brazil, the most interesting emergent economy of the world? This shows you how outdated is our international system. So I believe in globalization, even if globalization has problems to solve.
Yeah.
But you need in some way to perfectionate and to increase our international management crisis system if you want to face better the next global crisis.
Is that what you're hearing in the streets?
No,
they are talking about globalization? They're thinking about the global structures of power?
No, but there are a lot of translators.
Yes.
Will make an interpretation from the street. I don't know what you call the streets. Okay?
Yeah.
I don't know if you call the streets.
What do you call the streets?
You tell me. It's consumers,
yeah,
or it's just protesters.
Sure.
Okay, because protesters are organized. They can be more authentic or less authentic. Usually, those who protest against political leadership were those who elected that political leadership. So I believe in institutions. Institutions are the core of democracy. And I don't want to replace institutions by the street. Because we need mutual respect and we need some institutional order, okay? So there are many streets you can imagine, and I don't believe in the idea of street as a replacement for democracies or institutions, okay?
Mr. Secretary General, what are you hearing when you're walking the streets? What is it that they want right now?
Well, thank you very much for this, leading this panel. But I want to tell you that I was very much intrigued by the title. You combined street with democracy. And this is a very dangerous proposition. But it was a philosophy and a policy of some big powers, say 10 or 20 years ago, to help the democracy enter into certain society. They would instigate street to make some noises. So I believe that the title should have been a different one. The power of the street could be considered as part of the system, as the demonstrations we see in Europe, in certain capitals of Europe. But it could be also used as a weapon against stability in order to topple regimes. This is what happened in the Middle East. And it happened in some other parts, of course, of Eastern Europe, etc., and Eurasia. It has been a weapon in the hands of the powerful to create new situations in regions and countries that they wanted to change. You will recall that at that time of the turmoil in the Middle East, the talk was about creative anarchy, to create anarchy. And if the anarchy leads to change, then it is creative. This is a flawed and sinister policy or way of thinking. That's why we all got lessons of that. As you have said, you cannot replace institutions by just chaos in streets. So I want to stress the point that the street is not the best way towards democracy. And this has to be underlined. And I believe those who used the power of the street to change regimes have learned that.
And Mr. Secretary General, is it one or the other? Is it a 1 or 0? Or are there different degrees of what we're talking about today when we're looking at street power versus institutional power? Is it really one or the other? Or is it a mix of in between?
As long as you use the term street power, then it is either this or that. But if you are talking about the streets and its effects, its influence, etc., the development, that's another story. That's why the title is so dangerous that makes us here as if we are calling for the streets to help install democracy, meaning that the streets will impose what the masters say.
Yes.
This is a very serious proposition. That's why I really refuse to have a title of that kind. Democracy, streets, and the like.
I understand. Madam Minister, what is your thought when you walk the streets? What are you hearing? What is it that, in quotations again, the streets want? What are you hearing?
Voy a hablar en español.
Sí.
I am going to be speaking in Spanish. I do walk through the streets. I'm part of the feminist movement in my country. And if it weren't for the streets, I ask myself, how would women have come up with any options or been presented with options in a world where we have an order built by men throughout history, with laws designed by men historically, and a patriarchal system that have included women, that have ignored them, that have made them invisible. So I do believe that the street is important because it forces us to go over the processes that the institutions are trying to put forward, especially when institutions are not applying the minimum standards of democracy, when the institutions are corrupt, when they practice cronyism, where you only have the same actors going through them, being recycled by them. Countries such as Chile, student movements, feminist movements, led to a rethinking of systems and enabled us to see that there was sort of a lack of sensitivity on the part of the social classes, of the political class, that they were unable to empathize with those groups that didn't benefit from the society. The discourse would be, we all benefit from the common good. This is something we haven't had for decades in our countries, and it seems that we need to be using all of the tools necessary to produce this. I don't think the street is a mechanism that is needed for all of this. This mechanism would be institutions. What we cannot do, however, is not listen to what is going on in the streets so that we could at least properly interpret what people want. There is a serious problem. The street doesn't represent in a collective way what the street wants. Every leader represents what he wants or their group wants. So there's a lack of a democratic process. So what the street does is force us to listen to ourselves, to ask ourselves questions. For example, what is going on with the indigenous people? Why do we still have sexist and racist systems? It forces us to ask these questions. I think there are serious concerns, legitimate concerns that have been made clear through demonstrations, through protests. We know that protests are necessary, lead to change. It's not really the road to change, but we need to get over this lack of empathy that would lead us to properly understand what citizens are asking for.
Is there a middle in this discussion of that which is coming from the street and that which is institutional? And what might that look like?
A ver, en general hemos tenido, yo diría que lo que se ha observado más que nada en las democracias latinoamericanas es un fuerte deterioro.
What we've observed in Latin American democracies is growth in political parties, a significant growth in their number. There aren't one or two or three. There are 17 of them in Chile, 20-some in many Latin American countries, and that generates serious problems, especially when you need to reach agreements. Even though a few days ago in Argentina, we were able to reach a major agreement. In Chile, excuse me, we were able to reach a moment where we were voting for a new constitution, even though that didn't go through. I think we, in our democracies, are only using our systems, our institutional systems after protest, our tools after protest. I think we need to learn to use the tools of democracies before the protests arrive and not afterwards.
Minister, and if you can go to your apps, I have a question that I'd like you to engage in if you can. And that question is the first one: what will the streets want tomorrow? What will the streets want tomorrow? if you can give us your opinion. We would love to hear what your thought is. What will the streets want tomorrow? As we're getting that answer, I would like to ask you, Mr. Secretary General, when we think about democracy, when we look at those who are moving forward, protest productively, not productively, as you described, where's the willpower? Where's the willpower for a better democracy, for better practices, better outcomes? Where do you believe the willpower is?
Let me refer to your statement now, that the street thinks of what would come tomorrow. In fact, the street...
I think, is his mic on?
All right. Your observation about what does the street think about tomorrow?
Yeah, sure,
Yeah.
Mr. And we have some words, Mr. Secretary General, on the wall of what people are saying.
All right, tell me what's it.
Well, it says young leaders, it says change, it says dignity, it says anti-corruption, it says closing income gap, more freedom, better services, free Iran is another one, equity. That's basically some of the big words in there. Yeah.
Okay, all of that is correct.
Yeah.
But also, people need food, need better education, need health care.
Yeah.
They have immediate needs of today, not only of tomorrow. Tomorrow is for institutions, for you, for others that are thinking about what should happen tomorrow. But the masses, the poor people, people of the third world, they want to eat. They want to guarantee that they have a fine life today, not tomorrow. Therefore, it seems that there is a dichotomy between the thinking and the interests and the priorities of people in the third world, and the same in the first world. The first world can sit and think about what should happen tomorrow. But in the third world, the masses, the streets, are thinking differently. However, in the third world, okay.
All sorts of things are happening here, Mr. Secretary General. We're going to.
That's called correction.
That's right. That's talking about now. So we're going to get the sound right now.
Okay.
Please, though, we want to hear
now.
everything. Yes.
It is right now.
Yeah.
So this kind of dichotomy will have to be dealt with in panels like that. So the measurement that you, or the standpoint that you start from, is tomorrow, the new system, new international order, etc., which I also think of, and most of us do.
Yes.
But the situation is much more dangerous, serious, sensitive now.
Right.
Because of the changes in the world, and because of the economic crisis, the food crisis, and the security crisis.
Yeah.
There is a different development, very dangerous developments nowadays that we have to put before us.
Exactly. And very interesting, we go back to the word cloud. Bread was one of the responses for tomorrow, but that certainly is a need of today. And it was not one of the primary words that came up. Very interestingly, I read the primary words and ideas that came up, but not bread. Bread was, level 2, if you will, in the word cloud.
Whom did you ask?
Sure. Our esteemed guest here today. Yes, exactly. But you bring up that very important point, today versus the future.
Right.
Madam Minister, what is your thought about the words that came up from the word cloud in terms of what is the streets thinking of tomorrow versus today?
No me sorprende.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by what we've seen, what we've heard through the demonstrations, especially the more recent protests in Latin America. We've had many of them recently in Latin America, and they've been facilitated by the fact that they have left the active political space. A lot of people who should be in that space are not there. People are bored. People are tired. with inactivity, with a lack of a reaction to corruption and other things. I can talk to you about my own personal experience. I'm 54 years old. I was an activist in a political party since I was 13 years old in the Christian democracy. And 34 years ago, I turned my back to this period of activism. And I think that many of us are tired with practices that are not changing, and we are really not stepping up to the plate when it comes to young people. We have responsibilities we are not meeting. There are young leaders that need to be supported, and we're not supporting them as we should. But we are also there's also criticism as to what the street is doing with the processes. The street interconnects, unites, they protest, but they are unable to take one more step forward, which is to channel all of these demands and represent a collective movement. Divisions appear. There is also an apolitical culture that is very potent in our democracies, and they influence these movements, and protest remains at that level, and then things are taken over by the traditional political class, and change does not come about. I think we need to look at what happens after the protests, and I agree with the Secretary General. I think we need to look for new ways of moving forward. This is why I referred to dialogue. This is why I spoke about what needs to be done before protests so that we don't have the process that we saw in 2019.
I have to be clear about one point. When I speak,
Just put down your headphone, and there you go, perfecto. Yes.
The street movements to express views, to call for a better situation, that is an expression of point of view. But what I oppose is they using the street power to advance democracy. This is so sinister and so dangerous for the stability of countries. Democracy is a process, and the process has to take place emanating from the people. Democracy is the best system of governance, but at the same time, it cannot be decided that tomorrow we will apply democracy and that's it. It is a process. And I'm afraid that some Western powers think that democracy, first of all, it is a precondition for your life, a precondition for the help, and a precondition for the aid. Democracy as a precondition is a very negative expression, very negative policy. Democracy will have to seep in. Democracy, you know, all countries have parliaments. 194 or 93 countries have parliaments. Just the picture that a leader or a beautiful actress just voting, this is what some institutions in the West believe that, yes, that is very good. But underneath, there is no democracy in so many countries. So the show of democracy is the thing that I believe.
Well put.
Several Western countries think that that's it, that's enough. That is not enough.
Mr. Minister.
I agree partially with my dear friend Abu Masha, because democracy is a system. Freedom is a value. Democracy may not be universal. Freedom and human dignity must be universal. So I want to clarify with you the word, because it's a very equivocal word, street. Do you think it's street power, January 6th assault on Capitol? It's street power too. But take it cautiously. It was an assault against democracy. January 6th, in the United States of America, the largest Western power in the world, was an assault against democracy through street. Join people, have a condescending president saying, go violent, and that was an assault against democracy. So, if this is street, I'm against. Consider Tehran, Iran, freedom for women. It's not a matter of democracy, it's a value of human dignity of women. This is morally a middle-aged regime. I'm totally in favor of street fighting for women dignity in Iran. Third example, Gilets jaunes in France. Do you think I would stand for guys who say, I want retirement age at 60, even if life expectancy grew 12 or 14 years? This is unfair. You want to protect your selfish interest and have none consideration for common interest. So take care with the word street power, because there is street power to protect privileges. You have street power to aggressions, with aggressions to democracy, and you have street power fighting for very decent values. You cannot have an ideology of, do you know what is the risk? If you place street as an icon of the world, oh, democracy is the street, so we must pay attention to the street. Yes, but you know what is the risk? Transforming governance in a collection of likes. Sometimes you must be unpopular. Ruling a nation is not a matter of collection of likes. Sometimes you have to do unpopular things to protect common interest. And now, in nowadays, democracy is more and more transformed in a competition for likes in social media.
I think what
national interest is something different from that.
And Mr. Minister, what you're bringing up is the nuance of the use of the word street. That it does not mean the same thing for everybody. And it clearly has different, if you will, processes and applications and manifestations. Madam Minister, I know you wanted to get in on this conversation, please.
Sí, lo que sucede es que hay algo que está.
What happens is that there is something that's happening that is not quite working. We have problems in our democracy. First of all, corruption. Second, exclusion of certain sectors and parts of the population. Third, the lack of sympathy, the lack of capacity to listen. When we do not have that, then people take to the streets, and they do so to express their own demands. They converge. They are not coordinated, or may not be coordinated, but they actually converge. And what I am saying, what I believe we need to do, is to anticipate, as we should, to the evolutionary processes. Latin American democracies have not lived a revolution as such, although we've had female leaders, leaders from the native population, leaders who used to work at trade unions, etc. But how representative are our democracies? Can I just ask you a question? Of course. How comes Chile had an uprising with thousands of people taken to the streets and now has a constitution, an original constitution, which a constitutionary body that's totally independent and has been faced with rejection? What happened between the streets and the institution? Well, what happened there was that indeed the constituent that was chosen did not reflect what the country wanted, but that does not deauthorize the decision. What I am saying is that I do not interpret what is going on the streets as literally as you do. Sometimes you may be led to believe that they are big majorities, but they are just minorities. And when you get to the voting, you have a different result. But you know what happens? You cannot make a list and say, well, this feminist movement is authorized. Okay. This, not, because it's paid by whoever. And then this third one, yes, why not? Who can make that catalogue and that choice? Well, I just wanted to say, I know we get very passionate about this. I just wanted to say that I truly believe in this democratic system. However, as well as believing that governments are basically missing the presence of women and they're lacking more diversity from all sectors, I also believe that we're missing a new way of understanding democracy, that it's more sympathetic, that is able to interpret and understand what's lacking, and a kind of democracy that's hardest on the blocks or the blockers to this democracy.
Responses we have so far from our esteemed participants here at Atlantic Dialogues. Adam Buhadma says, don't you think we need to talk about people power instead of street power? Andreas Kramer says, what about social media? Are they part of the street or institutions? I think both of those comments bring up the idea of what is the literal, what is the figurative, right?
The correct expression, in my opinion.
It's much comprehensive.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. You and then you, please, Mr. Secretary General.
So, people's power.
Yeah.
To be expressed through the institutions or through demonstrations, expressing views.
Yes.
But the problem is the way the title was formulated.
Yeah.
You link up democracy with street power. Street power, as you see, there is a disagreement about it. There is a lot of, not
I didn't notice there was a disagreement.
but confusion
Yeah.
about the right interpretation, the correct interpretation
Right.
of that. So, as you see,
Yeah.
three of us, and I believe also the audience,
Sure.
agree that linking the democracy with the street power is so dangerous and should not have been put that way.
Mr. Minister.
Just, if I may, I think there is one thing we probably agree, the panel and many participants. You just need revolutions when you don't have reforms. You are in Morocco. Morocco has a fantastic head of state, His Majesty the King. He is a reformer. Reformer before Arab Spring, reformer before street. He was a reformer. Okay, you don't need revolutions when you have reforms. When reforms fail, maybe you're generating revolutions. So first comment I want. The second thing, I think I prefer the word people. Because many people, and I presume a majority of people, are not professional demonstrators, okay? They have to work, they have to pay their bills,
Yes.
they have their children's school, they have their families to rule, and they are not every day demonstrating, okay? They have elections. They can punish governments, or they can replace governments, or they can re-elect governments with their vote. And this is, for me, this is critical. With my vote, I can say what I think. The votes, at least, even in the United States, if I may be ironical, where you are always discussing if ballots are right, at least I know what is a majority and what is a minority. How can you evaluate what is a majority and a minority in street power? It's by a poll, it's by an image. No, in the ballot, you know who is the majority and who is the minority. In the street, it depends on interpretation. So my thing. The second relation is with social media, that I think it's very, I'm a registration of interests. I'm not in social media, and I don't intend to be.
It's one of the first things you said to me when we met this morning. Yes. Not social media.
I'm not in social media, and I don't intend to be. And if I may say something which is very unpopular, I think democracies need the declaration of independence from social media.
Okay, that will be the next plenary session.
They need, you know why? Let me just say, before punishing me, let me just say 2 or 3 things.
Okay, please.
Because political manipulation of social media is done by vanguards. Vanguards always want to impose you their opinion. Even if they lose elections, they want to impose their view to you, and the reason I don't use social media is very simple to explain. A, I don't love insults. I respect arguments. Second, I respect the difference between truth and false. When I go shopping and I want to buy a car, I don't accept a fake car. Social media is becoming the only business I know where people, market, accept conscientiously the fake. And when you accept fake, it's a dissolution of a basic notion between false and truth. The third is you're replacing moderation by extremism. Just pay attention. I shared with you an annual report every January. It's a very interesting report about, it's called We Are Social. How many hours each nation spends in social media per day? Pay attention to the results of this report. I presume the day still has 24 hours. Nobody changed it, okay? So, countries are, the ranking goes from 4 hours in social media every day, average, to 40 minutes. The less addicted to social media, Japanese, Germans, Austrians, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 1 hour per day. The more addicted to social media, people I love a lot, Argentinians, Brazilians. Just pay attention to the possible correlation between polarization
I want to bring it back to
and
what we're
addiction
discussing
to social
here.
media.
I want to bring it back to what we're discussing here, and I know, Madam Minister, you want to get in on this. As a journalist who's covered many a march over the last 20 years, the idea that majority versus minority is at the purpose of what marchers do. Is at the purpose of gathering in the streets to find a majority or minority of views or polling. I don't know if that's necessarily the objective. When it comes to social media, again, that's our next plenary, and we can definitely dig in on it. But I do want to at least level set the reaction so far. I enjoy all of this. Madam Minister, you wanted to react, and then I think I'll take the microphone. I saw a hand come up, and then we'll keep on going. Is that okay, Madam Minister?
Sí. Solo que
Yes, I just want to say that hunger will not be resolved by saying to the people, stop eating. Social networks, social media are used by the youth. I do not do TikTok videos, but I do have Twitter. I work with the youth day in and day out because I am an academic representative, and I think we should not deny the reality because this is not a way of building a different democracy. We have to take the lead and take responsibility.
I'm going to use the app, but I can see that some of you are already ready to go. Now, all of you are very well known, but for those who are watching digitally, please do announce who you are, and then your question to our panelists or your comment. Please keep your comments or questions to 30 seconds if you can, and to leave the deliberations by our panelists. Is that okay? Great. I love that. Let me turn on this mic, make sure it's ready to go. It is. Okay, my friend.
All right.
I'll hold it for you.
Okay.
Yes.
Magad Abdelaziz from Egypt. I agree that mixing the streets with democracy is wrong in the address. And why? Because we will be creating populist leaders like Trump in the United States, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, like others, number one. Number two, the role of different dynamic, the pandemics, the economic crisis, others made the societal shift towards the right in many countries, in Europe, in others, and made the popular move because people are getting poorer, people are getting fed up of the results, and that's why their move is much more stronger. Third, if you follow street, you have to accept the result. In the streets in some of the countries of the Middle East, if the street and the democracy produce a military leader, you have to accept that this military leader will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very well prepared remarks. Thank you so much. And I'll hold that for you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Yo una pregunta para la señora.
Thank you. I have a question for Mrs. Albonon. I am Youssef Al-Younad from Morocco. Don't you think that today, if we have massive access, when we have massive access to social media, we have access to the streets by the youth, we see this particularly in Latin America and in Africa. And I do not think that this is a result of the failure of internal policies or the result of the lack of reform or the lack of political leadership in many countries. I believe that, and I lived in Chile, by the way, and I know how your country works, and across Latin America and Africa today we have a crisis of political leadership, and that is what's pushing people to take to the streets and to access social media, because they don't have the means to express themselves. And as Paulo Porta said, today there is a lot of junk in social media, but people need a means to express themselves.
Excuse me, I'll stand right next to you.
My name is Charles Dahan. I'm from Washington, D.C. The one thing that you have mentioned is about social media, but the other facet of social media is the fake news that has affected a lot of problem in the world, and particularly in the United States. How do you address that?
All right, so several great comments. How would our panelists like to react? Madam Minister, I think you were addressed a couple of times, so how about you first?
Yes, I believe the problem of the fake news is not something that we only see on social media. There are leaders who are permanently resorting to fake news as a way of ruling. And by the way, speaking about democracies and different mechanisms, we have lots of constitutional reforms in Latin America that only kept dictators in power, as if it was the only means to sustain and maintain democracies. I do not agree with the idea that Trump or Bolsonaro are a good example. And it is interesting to analyze how they actually made it to the position of leadership. We have a problem, a leadership problem, a severe leadership problem, and we have an incapacity to understand each other, and that's why we have certain emotional illiteracy. There are certain problems that I hope will be resolved by the youth, but we need to work towards that aim. And the not so young should leave the necessary space. We should make room to the next generations of people continue in office forever. And there are many problems which we fail to see sometimes. And I think we have a severe leadership problem. We are not giving the necessary room to the new people. We are not capable of being generous. And then again, I will say this for the fourth time. Corruption is the main problem for our democracies. And this actually means not renovating the leadership, using personal influence or the common good to make business. This is something that is attacking the people, and it actually gives rise to uprisings, because, as my colleague said, people need to eat, and they can be easily manipulated when we are not resolving these issues for them.
On to our next question, please.
The question how to face fake news. So first, just one thing, Richard. One of the dangerous things of political manipulations through social media is replacing complexity by simplifications. You cannot solve a pandemic question in a tweet, okay? It's very nice, it gives you likes, you become popular, but it's completely false, okay? 90% just think about climate change. 90% of the problems of the world are complex. They are not solvable in 2 sound bites or 142 characters, okay? So this is my problem, is I respect, obviously, those who love social media, but don't try to solve magic questions in a magic way, thinking that you can solve it with 142 characters. Second, there are 2 discussions in the United States. I believe that's very relevant. One is a legislation discussion and a legislative discussion. The other one is a judiciary one. And again, United States, you can see the best and the worst. I prefer the best. But it's always the vanguard of some discussions. Question A. Do you think digital platforms are responsible for their contents? Yes or no? This is the discussion about Article 230 of the Telco Law of the United States. Are you responsible? You are the Facebook guy. You have responsibility for the contents in Facebook? Yes or no? If you are the owner of Wall Street Journal or New York Times, you are responsible for contents. And you go to court if you have defamation or violence. But in social media, don't. Just change the principle of not being responsible for the contents they publish, and maybe you will have a little bit more of common sense and rationality. This is the first discussion. There is a discussion on the United States about the Article 230 of the Telco Law. Are digital platforms responsible for the contents, or they are just a coffee where everybody absolutely irresponsible? The second question, it's a tough one. It's now in the Supreme Court. It's the algorithm question. You know that the daughter, the parents of a young girl that was in the wrong place in the wrong moment in Paris, she died in the terrorist attacks in Paris. She was a student in Paris. Her father and her mother, they go step by step, they went step by step, and finally the Supreme Court accepted to discuss this question, not freedom of speech, because all the terrorist attack was organized through social media, okay? The connections for the attack, for the terror, were established through social media. They are not trying to forbid freedom of expression. They are trying to forbid the algorithm of multiplication of violence. The algorithm is the last responsible for the multiplication of violent speeches, terrorist organizations, etc. So they are trying to oblige platforms to control algorithms when they according to the multiplication of terrorists and violence and fanaticism speeches. So those 2 discussions in a democracy, you don't solve problems in the Supreme Court tomorrow morning. It takes time. You don't solve problems in Congress tomorrow morning. Sure. It takes time.
And to the point, is that what social media is trying to do? We don't need to answer that question here. Are they trying to solve complex problems in 142 characters? I think those that would respond to your comment would say, that's not altogether the main objective necessarily. But let's save that for the next. Let's save that for the next plenary, though. I do want to move on to something else, Mr. Minister. I do want to move on to something else, and that is something that I know, Mr. Secretary General, you have profound experience and perspective and context on, and that is the very idea that as we saw the beginning of the Arab Spring, this idea of people, right? As we move forward now, 12 years later, we had something that was a 1,000-year event. That was the last 3 years. The entire world going through an experience that was absolutely catastrophic. What did that do to what started in 2010? And now as we're in 2022, was it renewed? Was it refreshed? Was it set back? This idea of what started in 2010, based on what happened in the last 3 years?
Well, I agree generally with what my colleague from Portugal has said, but I believe that we have gone a bit too far from the issue on the table now.
Yes.
There is one thing missing in our debate, that is good governance. Good governance is the thing that we all hope that we can achieve. Had there been good governance in the Middle East, 2010 and 11,
Yes, right.
no street power or foreign plans or foreign intervention would have succeeded. People were angry, and they tried to demonstrate and say, we are angry, we are dissatisfied, what's going on is absolutely wrong, so we need a change. That very peacefully, until the foreign hand came and pushed into a certain direction to topple and change regimes and so on. This beginning, this start of toppling regimes in order to start again produced a very confusing situation. And this confusing situation affected the outcome, and the years after that is only 12 years.
Yeah.
After 12 years
Yeah.
in the old world is
Yeah.
not that long period of
yeah.
time. But at the same time, now the Middle East is changing. The Arab world is changing. We are going through a process of change, moving towards a different one, a different atmosphere altogether.
Yeah.
This will demonstrate the will of the people. You talked about the willpower and the people's power, not the street power, the people's power. We think the majority of Egyptians and Arabs believe that what happened in 2011 was indeed a catastrophe, because it created a situation of chaos. States stopped functioning, and we had to start again. In fact, they imposed this kind of democratic process, imposed governments that could not and did not show any program or ability to govern properly, etc. Therefore, changes came. And the Middle East has is in a special situation. There are a lot of foreign hands playing, a lot of foreign hands trying to impose this or that regime. That's why good governance is, in my opinion, the key. We have to move into good governance, and including, by the way, good governance means that we are on the right road towards democracy.
Quick question.
This is part of good governance.
Yeah, for good governance, has the last 3 years, I'll readjust my question, has the last 3 years, 2-3 years, reinvigorated the idea of good governance in a way that has never happened before because of this global experience?
Yes,
what would you say?
Yes, indeed. That's why that discussion and the policy is going along certain blocks. Number one, you have to rebuild the country. Number two, you have to deal properly and decisively with corruption. Number three, we have to move towards democracy, which we agree, you agree with me, and I believe we all agree that it is a process that will take time, but we have to start. Number four, we have to address the needs of today, of the poor people, of the poor, of the so on. So the Middle East is in a state of change, and towards a different future, a totally different future. This does not mean that we just throw away whatever of the cases or problems, etc., and forget about them. No, we should not go, and we shouldn't forget about them.
But your focus on good governance is so important.
Yes, we have to give enough time to deal with those old problems, but to look to the future too, and hope for a better, and work for, not hope for, work for a better situation.
We're going to get to some questions and answers from the audience and participants in about 2 minutes, but Madam Minister, I wanted to move from what Secretary General was saying on the idea of good governance and this new refreshed energy that you're saying that you agree with, Mr. Secretary General. To you, Madam Minister, does that include gender equity? Does that include the 50% of the world in a different way than it had before? You brought that up earlier, that we are coming from a place that did not necessarily look at gender equity and governance equally. Are we now re-energized in a way that will make a boosted change in the coming years, from your perspective?
Yo no tengo tanta.
I don't have that much faith in this. If we are unable to establish minimum thresholds, we have to be able to see another way of defending democracy, not the way my father did it or my grandfather did it. We need a democracy where in the past we had democracy that functioned within a certain framework. Things have changed. We are now in a global context. We have campaigns to reach zero pollution. We had COP27. Countries agreed to serious change during that COP. And the young people are worried because they're worried about the future. We're going to leave them. Many of them don't want to have children, don't want to establish families because they're worried about the future. We don't need to be pessimistic, but we really need to turn to a new form of democracy. We can't continue to use the same medicine that hasn't worked for the disease. We, as far as gender is concerned, we haven't been using the right model. We've talked about more opportunities, greater female participation, and this has just been a nice concession. No, women have earned this by going out into the streets, by participating in protest demonstrations. Nobody just handed it to them, not even through affirmative action have they gained parity. It's been very difficult to reach parity. I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor, and I see that throughout the entire judicial and legal system, you have a patriarchy, you have laws that could be modified to be more equitable. I think we need to change things, go through a paradigm shift in the economy, in politics, so that they are more inclusive, to include that 50% of the population, but also to include populations that have been made invisible, segments of the populations that have not been participating in political decision-making. This is what our democracies that need to be working towards. We can't use old models to solve modern problems.
For this very topic you and I are talking about, we are living in better times, but we're also living in more difficult times when it comes to gender equity. At least as a reporter, that's what I saw. More difficult times, but also better times, both coming together after the last 3 years. Is that fair to say?
Sí, porque en materia.
Yes, when it comes to gender equity, we've gone backwards. There have been advances. But you have countries where women have had to leave schools and go back into hiding in their homes, who've had to wear the burqa once again. This is what's happening in reality. What about those places where migration, that international migration process, who are concerned with this? Who is migrating? Who is used during wars? Where do we see sexual abuse? This is what we see in Central America. Look what happens in northern Chile with the migratory process. You have child sexual exploitation. Who is involved in that? Little girls, young girls, not young boys, or essentially young girls. Abuse has a gender, abuse has a name, and we haven't been able to see it, and we have been unable to speak about it clearly. I want male leaders who speak out for women's demands. We are the ones, we women are asking for these changes. And what are men doing? They're observing, they're listening, they're supporting, but this is something we should all be calling for. No exclusion. Everyone has to be calling for that.
Part of the conversation, not just 100%, it's the 50-50. We're now going to transition to what will be my last poll question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience here in the 14 minutes and 22 seconds left in front of us. And that is our third, to my friends over that are taking care of the app, if you can go there, how important is people power to democracy? How important is people, if you can go to your app and just put in number 1 through 6, how important is people power to democracy? And there
is democracy without people?
So please react.
No, I'm just questioning about the search.
Yeah.
If there is democracy without people, because democracy is sovereignty of people, we cannot confuse completely the concepts. There are autocracies with people and autocracies without people, but I don't know democracies without people's sovereignty. Don't oppose democracy and people, for God's sake. You're creating the room of maneuver for tyrants.
I'm not.
No, you don't. You don't.
I'm sitting
you don't.
here and
you don't.
I got this thing, Mr. Minister. I gotta read this thing. It's right here in front of me.
Let me just
I love
say,
you people,
Laura.
I love you people. What are you talking about?
But let me say just to Laura that, man, I understand what perfectly you said. I withdraw from the Christian Democrats' leadership to a woman, a remarkable woman, a very good friend and remarkable woman. But things progressed a lot because men with more will or less will, they elected Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. Oh. Okay, you can tell me Margaret Thatcher is not my cup of tea as a feminine leadership. But anyway, she was the first female prime minister, relevant female prime minister in the Western world. And second, man elected Angela Merkel.
Dos.
Continue.
Okay.
Right. You're progressive.
You are right.
2. They've elected 2. Okay, so they've elected 2.
Progress.
50%. 50%.
Okay. I just say the Scandinavian. 100%.
I want to bring it back to
Denmark, Sweden,
okay.
Norway.
I appreciate the reaction. Okay. This is good. But I want to go back to this idea is people power / street power.
5, 6.
Well, / street power, because we were bringing that concept together, weren't we?
6.
So that's why this
70%.
So we have 70 and 6, this idea of street and people power.
Yeah.
Clearly, there is a spectrum here. Okay, I want to get out to our great participants here, and our emerging leaders. I'm going to go to you first. So this is a question for emerging leaders. All right, we have some over here. I just didn't hear them earlier, so please. I got it. You can say your name.
I see some colleagues around the room, so I want to be quick. My name is Savannah Lane. I'm from Washington, D.C. Honored to be here. What a great discussion. We've talked a lot about the idea of focusing on reform or protests or street power, and I think that there's an intersection. A big theme throughout is this anger. There's a lot of anger. There's frustration from disenfranchised people. So what is a positive way that we can take that, be solution-oriented, and be effective? Because people are frustrated, and I think that's why we're seeing so much, especially in person and on social media.
Give me an idea in 30 seconds.
We've seen, you've mentioned...
How can we be positive?
How can we be positive? Well, I think we've seen solutions-oriented discussions with our emerging leaders. I think it's a combination of feeling heard, but also coming up with realistic short-term institutional changes, and that doesn't happen overnight.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to go that way, if that's okay, my emerging leaders, friends, and then we'll get reaction from our panelists. I got it.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Nusrat Farooq. I'm from India, working in Washington, D.C. I think protests are important within a democracy, peaceful protests. When protests become violent, we don't like it, but why do people do violent protests in the first place? Do we ask that question? Is it because governments violently suppress peaceful protests because they are afraid that their government will be toppled? That anger will come out in some form. Now, the question is, why are protests happening more in the global south versus the global north? Thank you.
Great question. I want to get one other question from an emerging leader over there, and then our panelists can react. Please, over here. You can say your name and what your question is. I will hold the microphone.
Sure. My name is Fatima. I'm from Somalia, and I'm one of the Adele cohorts. So my question is coming from the context of working in Africa. I'm specifically working in Guinea, Mali, Sudan, where we have seen a lot of people-led protests, and people are cheering for change. And they're cheering for change because they want more democracy. So I heard comments around that we need to do it through the ballots, we need to do it through reform. So my question is, how do we address this democratic renewal where we have people-led democracies when there are poor leadership and when there are a lack of good governance? Because this is not so inherently as a solution in these contexts where, for instance, in Sudan, there is a reform, but people are still fed up. So how do we do this when there is poor leadership, people are not being heard in the ballots, and there are poor governance? What are the practical solutions that we can do to make it more inclusive?
Fantastic. 3 great questions to our panelists. Who wants to go first?
Just, I respect all the opinions. I listened a lot about anger. If you compare, if you benchmark historically, the generation of my parents lived in a much more difficult context than me. Next generation, the legacy for next generation is much more developed than the one I received. So the first thing is not losing the context,
the arc of the context.
parameter.
The arc, yeah.
So the generation of my fathers and mother, they still know what is war, war with not having one lunch and one dinner to provide to population, to have restrictions, etc. So there was a much positive evolution since Europe was in ruins till the 21st century. First. Second, anger. I accept there are many reasons for anger. Many were explicited here. But don't forget, anger is also stimulated by digital democracy.
You have a theme here, Mr. Minister.
No,
yeah, you have a theme.
No.
Yes, yes.
Don't you know that?
Yes, I've been around. I've been around.
Richard,
yes.
pay attention to what is Trumpism.
Yeah,
it's stimulation of bad emotions.
I know a little bit about that. I understand.
It's incentive to anger, to violence. And by the way, you need one word I didn't listen. You don't have it in America. We are losing it in Europe. Compromise. Compromise, the possible compromise between the center-right and the center-left, the socialists and the conservatives. At least a little bit of compromise. You are dissenting in everything.
I will compromise on that point, and I'll go to Madam Minister, because we've got time. I want to make sure to get to more questions.
But if you compromise, you are
I would like to respond to the questions asked by the new leaders, the new women leaders. I don't think we have an answer for all of these problems, one single answer. However, there are methods which are dialogue, listening, active listening. Chile went through a process of social explosion. We led a change for constitutional reform, which we lost, but that allowed for an opening of the dialogue. Even though we lost, that's important. And that led to diminishing of protests because we were able to use institutions to promote democracies. And this is what we need. We need to use mechanisms so that all democracies, with their form of democracy, with their traditional forms of democracy, are able to go through reform, through changes, and include new generations.
Well, anger is a very strong element in the reaction of people, not as part of what the society or the government is doing. Anger has to do with the needs of the people and their dissatisfaction of how governments are dealing with them. Anger is a very important provocation, reason that provokes reactions, negative reactions, and if governments cannot really deal with their needs, then comes the revolution and the streets and so on. So anger, I agree that this is a very strong element in what we are talking about. But again, my colleague here is talking about the Western societies. Compromise between right and left. Compromise between the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. There is another world that we cannot accept this kind of compromise in the interpretation he was speaking about. We cannot live that way. And a compromise between what? What can we, between poverty and richness? Poverty, how can we compromise there? Corruption, we have to be very decisive. So it is not only compromise, it is a Western kind of discussion about internal situations in certain countries. But we are talking about the South, about the whole world. And now I believe the leadership that the West has exercised for so many centuries are approaching its end. The philosophy, the way of thinking, the examples, articles, so and so from the Constitution of the United States works only for the United States. It will not work for all of us. So our discussion has to deal with the situation in the world, not only in the West. That's why the debate and going about the issues pertaining to social countries and social movements, the way it was dealt with here, I believe, needs more clarification. The discussion, our discussions at this juncture will have to address the problems that most of the people of the world are suffering from. And I don't think the solutions coming according to those kind of developments in Western countries would succeed, would be the real remedy for situations in the third world or in the South.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes. I'm going to get to a couple more questions, and if you could keep it to 30 seconds, I'd really appreciate that, and then we'll close the session.
Hi, my name is Nakoshi. I'm from Washington, D.C. I just had a point on the social media because I do think we need a more balanced approach to how we look at it because it's not going anywhere. I'm a former U.S. diplomat in the Department of State, and we actually use social media, Facebook, to reach other publics in foreign countries to tell them about American culture, right? To reach out to them to teach students about student visas, how to apply. That's one example. How can governments properly mobilize social media to reach their publics more effectively and constructively?
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this side, since I'm standing over here? No, and one more over there. Great, great, great. Thank you. Fantastic. I got you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, panelists, for this very inspiring exchanges. The question I have is, as I hear the conversation around streets power, people's power, keyboard power, isn't this street a channel, a platform, and at the end, at the center of it is still people? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And secondly, people will always raise their voices when they're pushed against the world. Where are they going to express that? The digital platforms are a new discovery which is becoming generational. We haven't got a grip of it to really use it effectively. We're applying international laws on violations that are happening on the digital platforms that are more dangerous, more toxic than what is happening on the streets. So between street power, I think street, to me, and humbly, is a platform of expression, just like the digital space is an emerged platform of expression. The question is how leadership and how global policy can intervene to make sure that its governance at the digital space is taken care of. But at the street, it gave us civil liberties.
Right.
It gave the Iranian women to raise their voices for wakening up the conscience of humanity. If leadership fails, if institutions fail, where are the people going to express? They cannot express it in the ballot box. So there is a toxic continuum to it, but there is a huge positivity. It gives us Martin Luther King. It gives us Mandela. It gives us Gandhi. It gives us other leadership. If you look at Palestine, how on earth are they going to raise the inequities and the suffering of the people if they don't have a platform of expression? For them, the only valve of expression is the streets, and it's not going to go away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, fantastic comments. I appreciate both of yours. We have just run out of time, and so we'll leave those as either rhetorical questions and or comments about both social media and what the street may be. And I want to finish, and if my great panelists who have been, thank you for bringing everything, by the way. Thank you for bringing everything. We're not done. I want you, in one sentence, tell me what you think brings hope to the idea of whether it's people power or street power as we now move into a very different phase in the North and the South, now that we're post-COVID, we're living in a space after COVID had hurt so many different countries. So one sentence from you, if I can, Madam Minister, that gives you hope.
Oh.
This is difficult. I believe that young people, men and women, are what is most important, young people.
Remember, democracy started with an agora, a square. What I don't accept is the substitution of institutions.
One sentence, if you can, Mr. Secretary General, that gives you hope. Okay. Gives you hope for the future. One sentence.
Number one, I believe what our colleague here has said, but Mandela revolted against colonialism, not in this context of government.
All right, that's for the next plenary. One sentence.
In one sentence, I am hopeful that a certain balance in the international situation will be created. Therefore, we will not be under the mercy of any superpower to dictate on us what to do and how to live.
Thank you so much, Laura Albornoz,
Okay, thank you.
Amre Musa, Paulo Portas, Street Power, Willpower, and Democracy. What a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a coffee break and reconvene at 11:15. Thank you.